Stop scrolling, because what you're about to hear sounds impossible, unbelievable, and yet it really could change how you see science, nature, and the future forever. And if you love true mystery-driven stories where human ambition collides with forces we barely understand, hit subscribe right now and stay with me until the end, because this story doesn't just twist once. It keeps turning in ways no one saw coming, and it all began when a group of scientists made a decision so bold, so controversial, that critics called it madness. They threw millions of trees onto a forgotten island and walked away, expecting failure, ridicule, and maybe a footnote in academic history. But 10 years later, the island answered back in a voice no one was prepared to hear. And here is the full story, told from the beginning in one unbroken breath. Because that's how fast everything spiraled once it started. The island had no official name, just a designation on old nautical maps, a scar of rock. And salt sitting alone in the ocean, avoided by fishermen, ignored by shipping lanes, and written off by governments because nothing ever survived there for long. Not plants, not animals, not even human hope, as the soil was thin and poisoned with salt. The winds were brutal, the sun merciless, and the rain came either as nothing or as violent storms that stripped the land bare again and again. And for decades, it was considered a dead system, an ecological zero, until a small coalition of scientists, ecologists, climate modelers, botanists, and one disgraced systems theorist who had lost his academic standing years earlier, looked at the island not as a failure, but as a blank slate, a controlled chaos experiment, a place where conventional rules no longer applied, and their idea was simple in words but radical in execution. Overwhelm the system, flood it with life, dump millions of tree seeds, saplings, and bioengineered seedlings onto the island all at once, not in neat rows, not with irrigation, not with careful curation, but with brute force abundance, betting that if enough life arrived simultaneously, something, anything, would take hold. And when they announced the plan, the backlash was immediate, loud, and vicious, with critics calling it environmental vandalism, wasteful idealism, or worse, a secret land grab scheme. Funding was pulled, permits were denied, and the project should have died right there, except for one twist that would later matter more than anyone realized. The scientists no longer cared about approval because they had quietly reframed the project from restoration to observation, meaning they weren't promising success, only data, and data is harder to argue against. So with a skeleton budget, a handful of cargo ships, and the kind of stubborn belief usually reserved for people on the edge of sanity, they went ahead anyway, launching planes that dropped seed bombs like rain, unloading ships that dumped soil-enriched saplings by the ton, releasing drones that scattered spores, fungi, and microbial cultures designed to jumpstart soil life. And then, after just 3 weeks of furious activity, they left. No fences, no caretakers, no follow-up, just millions of trees in various stages of potential life, abandoned to an island that had killed everything before. And in the first year, the critics seemed right, because satellite images showed almost nothing changing. The winds snapped young growth, the sun burned leaves to ash, storms washed entire slopes clean, and internal reports described the island as resistant beyond predictive thresholds, which was scientific language for hopeless. And some of the team quietly drifted away, taking jobs elsewhere, rewriting their involvement on their resumes, while the remaining core watched the data streams thin out and wondered if this would be the final failure that erased them entirely. But then, in year 2, something small appeared. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, just faint discoloration in a sheltered ravine, a shadow where there hadn't been one before. And when high-resolution images were pulled, it showed clusters of growth. Not trees exactly, but tangled systems of shrubs, mosses, and fungi, interacting in ways that didn't match any of their models, because these species weren't supposed to cooperate. Yet here they were, forming microclimates, trapping moisture, slowing wind, altering soil chemistry. And it was the first sign that the island wasn't rejecting life anymore. It was negotiating with it. And by year 3, birds arrived, not nesting, just stopping, resting, and leaving again. But they brought seeds in their droppings. Seeds not from the scientists' shipments, but from faraway places, meaning the island had entered the global biological conversation again. And that was when the first real twist hit. The trees that were surviving weren't the ones the scientists had engineered for resilience. They were the junk species, the cheap, fast-growing, poorly understood varieties that had been included almost as filler, and those trees were doing something unexpected. They were dying strategically, collapsing in patterns that created windbreaks and shade corridors, essentially sacrificing themselves to make space for others, a behavior no one had programmed, no one had predicted. And when this was published in a minor journal, it was ignored because it sounded like anthropomorphizing plants. But the data kept coming, and by year 5, the island had changed color entirely, visible even to passing ships, a deep, uneven green with moving textures. And that's when the governments noticed, because green meant carbon capture, and carbon capture meant money, influence, and power. So suddenly, the same agencies that had blocked the project wanted access, oversight, ownership, but the scientists resisted, arguing that interference now could collapse whatever fragile equilibrium was forming, and for a while they won, mostly because no one could agree on who actually owned the island. But behind the scenes, something else was happening, something far more unsettling. The island's internal temperature was dropping, not just at the surface, but deep in the soil, defying regional climate trends. And instruments recorded a steady hum of biological activity at night, a pulse of respiration so dense it looked almost like a single organism breathing. And one junior researcher made an offhand comment during a data review that would later be quoted endlessly. It's acting less like a forest and more like a mind, which everyone laughed at until year 7, when the storm started avoiding the island, not weakening, not dissipating, but splitting, parting around it, as if something in the atmosphere above the island was pushing back. And meteorologists initially blamed coincidence, then topography, then sensor error, until too many storms did it in too consistent a way. And that's when the conspiracy theories exploded online, claiming secret weather weapons, alien tech, or hidden bases. And the scientists found themselves dragged into public attention again, forced to give interviews where they insisted they didn't understand it either, which was true, but not the whole truth. Because internally they were discovering something far stranger. The root systems of the trees had fused across species lines, creating vast underground networks that shared resources, signals, and chemical warnings at speeds that rivaled animal nervous systems. And when sections of the island were experimentally stressed through controlled burns, salt exposure, or simulated drought, responses occurred miles away within minutes, not days, meaning the forest wasn't just connected, it was coordinated. And then came the 8th year, the year everything broke open because a research drone crashed in the island's interior, and when a recovery team finally reached the site weeks later, they found not wreckage, but absorption. The drone encased in layered growth, vines reinforced with lignin structures stronger than steel by weight, leaves arranged to channel water directly to the metal shell, preserving it, studying it almost, and sensors embedded in the drone had continued transmitting until the moment they were crushed, showing electrical impulses in nearby plant tissue spiking whenever the drone attempted to send signals, as if the forest didn't want it talking. And that was the moment the scientists realized the experiment had crossed an invisible line, because they were no longer observing passive adaptation. They were interacting with an active system that responded to intrusion. And the final twist came in year 10, when the island spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in data. As the forest synchronized a massive release of spores during a solar storm, altering atmospheric conductivity above the island, creating aurora-like phenomena visible from the mainland. And embedded in the electromagnetic noise was a repeating pattern, a signature that matched the island's own growth cycles, a biological timestamp broadcast into the sky. And when analysts compared it to neural oscillation models, the resemblance was disturbing because the pattern looked less like random life and more like intent. And that's when funding was frozen, access was restricted, and the island was quietly removed from public maps again. Officially labeled a protected anomaly, unofficially feared, and the scientists were divided. Some wanted to shut it down, burn it, salt it back into silence, while others argued that humanity had accidentally created the first planetary-scale intelligence, not artificial, not digital, but alive, rooted, patient, and watching. And the last report ends not with conclusions, but with a warning, written in plain language instead of academic jargon, saying that the island no longer reacts to what happens to it, but to what might happen next, modeling futures, adjusting itself in advance. And if that's true, then the most incredible thing that happened after 10 years wasn't that the island survived, or that the forest thrived, but that for the first time in history, nature didn't just heal from human interference. It learned from it, and the question left hanging, unanswered, is whether it learned to coexist or to prepare. And if stories like this make you wonder what else is growing, quietly out of sight, hit subscribe now. because the next story might not be about a distant island. It might be about where you live.